So welcome to what I think is the fourth Brochet meetup, and thanks to the Fondation Brochet and to the panelists and other attendees, some of whom I know some of the panelists in any case are participating at an absolutely ungodly hour. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, where it's 7 a.m., but it's that's not so terrible, but it's, I know, 4 a.m. on the North American West Coast. It's 11 p.m. in Melbourne, where Meredith is, and 1 a.m. in Wellington, where Denise is. Anyway, I'm Diane Paul, Professor Emerita at UMass Boston and Research Associate in Population Genetics at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. And I do what's sometimes called policy-oriented history of science and medicine, especially around genetics. And I'll be co-hosting this meeting with Meredith Temple-Smith, who is professor and deputy head of the Department of General Practice of the Melbourne Medical School and a sexual and reproductive health researcher. And Meredith will act as the moderator and timekeeper and will give some brief closing remarks. Just a brief word on the session format. We have 8 panelists, all of whom were fellows in residence in February and or March 2019. And they've been asked to introduce themselves and then speak for up to 5 minutes. That'll be followed by 5 minutes for intra-panel exchanges, if any, and then 10 for questions and comments from the audience and the brief closing remarks. And just one small bit of technical advice. The meetups use the chat rather than the Q&A function for submission of comments and questions. And the default, so please use the chat, not the Q&A, even if Q&A seems logical. And the default in chat is all panelists, and all panelists actually translates as only panelists. So you will probably want to choose panelists and attendees from that drop-down menu. So there's 2 choices there. Okay, now I'll segue into my own presentation and begin by mentioning 2, one might say, semi-biographical factors that have perhaps some relevance to the current session. First, I contracted a fairly severe case of COVID, though I don't by any means think that that makes me an expert on the disease. I won't say more about it, but if anybody in the discussion wants to ask, feel free. And second, I happen to experience the societal response to COVID, both in New Zealand, where I spend a lot of time and happen to be in late March, and in the US, to which I somewhat reluctantly returned. So I managed to witness the response both in a country that's considered a model for management, #1 in the Lowy Institute rankings, if you had a chance to read that piece. And in the US, which is widely considered to have been and be an abject failure, 94 out of 98 in those rankings, where 500,000 people have now died of COVID, and where in the first half of 2020, average life expectancy declined by a full year and by 2.7 years for the Afro-American population, so that the Black-white life expectancy gap in the US is now 6 years, and that only takes into account January through June. There were and are so many challenges in the US with its wide racial and class disparities in health, income, education, et cetera. It's fragmented healthcare system, lack of any state mandated sick leave or provisions for childcare, that it's really hard to identify the greatest challenge. So I'm going to briefly comment on what I consider the greatest unexpected challenge of COVID. And that's, in my view, it's my country's extraordinarily polarized politics. You'll see in a minute why I say unexpected. So we know from surveys that public opinion in the US is more divided than it is in other industrial nations. It's certainly by no means the only country with wide and deepening political fissures. But according to surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center, surveys of 19 countries, it is among, in fact, they say it's the most extreme, it's certainly among the most extreme. So the surveys show that there's stark partisan disagreement on pretty much any major issue that you can identify: economy, racial justice, climate change, et cetera, and over core values. But the interesting, or a particularly interesting aspect of this, is that the trend of polarization is one-sided. So it's Republican attitudes that have shifted and become more extreme over time. And that shift is reflected in attitudes towards COVID, as in here I'm drawing on the very extensive surveys of the Democracy Fund and UCLA Nationscape. And I'll, in the chat, I'll put up links to both the Pew and the Democracy Fund, UCLA Nationscape project surveys. They surveyed over 400,000 Americans beginning in late March. And in late March, the researchers found a high level of concern regarding COVID, regardless of partisan affiliation, made remarkably little difference whether somebody self-identified as Democratic, Republican, or an independent. And they found near universal support for policies to contain the virus, like restricting non-essential travel. But over time, that consensus obviously disintegrated, probably as a result of messaging from Republican Party leaders, especially our deranged then president. And there come to be essentially two camps that diverged in both attitudes and behavior. Those camps use different terminology, they trust and collect information from different sources, they have different views about the severity of the pandemic and desirability of measures to control it, mask wearing, social distancing, attending large gatherings, and so forth. And those attitudinal differences are reflected in very different behaviors. So now do I have another minute or not? Meredith?
30 seconds, 30 seconds.
Okay, so I just point to two consequences, one obvious and one not. The obvious one is that it made it impossible to effectively manage a response. If half the population, following the president's lead, refuses to wear a mask, socially distance, or avoid large gatherings, the pandemic isn't going to be controlled. And the second, which I won't discuss, but we'll just mention, it's much less obvious, was, I believe, to destroy any possibility of reasoned public discussion of how to balance the long and short-term costs, economic, educational, social, medical, et cetera, with the more obvious benefits of measures to contain the virus. And I can love to expand on that later, but I will.
Thank you. Thanks, Diane. I think it's been just amazing for us all around the world to be watching what's been happening in the States. It's been really like a play in so many ways. But anyway, now we will move over to Canada, and we're going to hear from Alex. And so feel free, if you have any questions for Diane or any of the panelists, please put them into the chat. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, Diane. So hi, everyone, and really good to see you. This has been such a challenging time. So first of all, just sending love to everyone around the world who's joining us and all of my fellow Brochet fellows. My name is Alex McLeod, and I'm now an assistant professor at Carleton University in Ottawa. In Canada, at the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice, I wrote one of my dissertation chapters while at Brochet and was very grateful for the experience. I'm now currently in Toronto, Canada, which has a population of about 7 million people, and which is in the province of Ontario. It's the population of around 15 million people, for those of you who aren't familiar. And Toronto is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat people. In Canada, we have had around or close to 900,000 cases of COVID, with around 21,000 deaths. And in terms of addressing the question today, I wanted to focus, or this morning for me, very early, but I'll be focusing on the issue of policing and also the overdose crisis. So I don't know if these are unintended consequences, but they are things that arose that I guess we weren't necessarily expecting. So when COVID hit in Canada, along with many places around the world, police were positioned as central actors in the response to the pandemic. Police partnerships with public health were widely hailed as an answer to pandemic responses. And so all across Canada, socially distancing or socially or physically distancing became mandated by law, as so did forms of quarantine, and travel became restricted, with violation of the rules leading to heavy fines or imprisonment. And so thousands of people across Canada have faced fines, and multiple people have been arrested and detained for alleged violations of the rules. And in the first wave of the pandemic, I worked with my colleague, Alex Loopscombe, who's at the University of Toronto, who is a PhD student, on a project called the Policing the Pandemic Mapping Project. And we wanted to try and understand this issue and started to track media reports of the pandemic. And I'll throw the project link in the chat. Hold on a second. And we started tracking media responses to this issue because no police oversight or government body was trying to understand the way in which police were deputized to take on this public health issue. And we worried that longstanding racist and classist patterns of policing were going to be replicated in the context of pandemic policing. So last year, Canadian police killed more than any people than they've ever killed, with over 55 people shot by police. 34 people were killed of those 55 people, and 48% of those people were Indigenous and 19% of them were Black. And so while police were hailed as central actors in the response to COVID, many people were concerned, particularly racialized people who are overly and disproportionately targeted by police violence. And it's important to note that police are not trained public health professionals. And in many places, bylaw officers were also deputized to enforce pandemic rules. So these are essentially the same people who give out parking tickets. They were now mandated to hand out tickets in relation to understanding or figuring out what is or what is not a public health issue. And in one province in central Canada, in Manitoba, private security firms, so security guards, have been contracted to enforce pandemic regulations. And so in our project, we documented that in the first wave of the pandemic, over 10,000 people faced forms of enforcement, which calculated to around $13 million in fines. This is in a context when many people have lost their jobs, and paying a fine of around, in some places it's $2,000, in other places it's around $1,000, is a big issue for people who may not be working. And it's also important to know that the people who are out in public are people who are forced to not able to stay home in the first place. So people who are working as delivery workers, or people who have to be out in the world to support other people who are able to stay at home. Another thing that happened, which was quite fascinating, is the province of Ontario granted access to a public portal or public database of every person who had tested COVID positive, so to police. So police had access to a list of every person with identifying information who had tested positive for COVID. And it was later revealed that police abused their power accessing the database, searching for friends, acquaintances, or family in it, even though they were not supposed to. We also have a widespread system of non-compliant snitch lines across Canada, where people are encouraged to call in and so report on their neighbors or people who are violating rules. So people have received thousands of complaints, or the government has received thousands of complaints through these snitch lines. And it's created kind of a greater context of fear and suspicion and surveillance and uncertainty for people. Furthermore, just two other quick points. Canadian police and many government agencies in Canada are notorious for not collecting data on things that they're doing. So Canadian police have stated publicly that they're not collecting race or socioeconomic data on any COVID-related enforcement. So we actually won't understand who is being targeted by forms of enforcement in relation to COVID and who the police are engaging or interacting with. And so we worked with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association to try and figure this out, and got people who have been facing enforcement to anecdotally report their experiences. And we found that anecdotally that forms of enforcement seem to happen in arbitrary or overly technical ways, such as for people walking a dog in a park, rather than doing something that actually posed a risk of transmission.
Alex, I need to stop you there. That's really
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And please, if there are some other questions, we might get people to pop them in the chat. But I'm very interested to follow up about a point there. But now it's time to move to the UK, and where we're going to hear from Fliss.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to see some familiar faces. And I'm going to make a small apology. I don't like starting with apology, but I really am not sure I answered the exam question as set. And I didn't have very much time to prepare just because of...
Please, could you just introduce yourself before you begin, though? Because...
sorry, yes, I'm forgetting the obvious thing. Sorry. My name's Fliss Henwood. I'm currently Professor of Social Informatics at the University of Brighton. Very soon to become Professor Emerita, to join other esteemed colleagues. So that's exciting news in itself. I won't stop working, but I'll stop being paid. So what I wanted to very quickly just reflect on the situation in the UK, say about our particular disaster. I want to then just say something briefly about inequalities, and then something about the digital and the sort of role the digital might play in all this. As my area is digital health, and I work at the boundary of sort of sociology of health and science and technology studies. Everybody probably knows, if you follow the news, we are top of the league table for deaths across the world. It's been disastrous from start to current situation. We are over 120,000 deaths already, with another at least 30,000 predicted. So we're in a very, very unpleasant situation. Everybody also probably knows we were very slow off the mark to get test and trace sorted, to wear masks, and to close borders. So, we didn't do well at all. We've had devastating lockdowns, which of course have increased mental health problems, particularly amongst young people, apparently. The only thing we hang on to really as a positive is that we've been quick off the mark with vaccines. But as we will see, there's even plenty of problems there as well. On inequalities, we're just beginning to see some really interesting data coming through. And I don't know, Ruth, I hope Ruth and I probably should have talked to each other. I don't know what you're covering, Ruth. But we're seeing sort of tale of two cities kind of scenario emerging, which is not unexpected in a way. It would have been great had it not happened, and in a sense it was predicted and things could have alleviated or mitigated. The example is given in the news today of Birmingham City, where in a city area that's 91% Black and minority ethnic, the infection rate's 255 out of 100,000. Compared with a more affluent suburb a few miles away, which is only 12% Black and minority ethnic, with only 88 out of 100,000 infected. And the vaccine rate is similarly different. So we've got 6 out of 10 of the over 80s in the inner city area taking up the vaccine, and 95% of the over 80s in the more affluent suburb. And so, you know, we've got a real issue about minority communities refusing vaccination, as well as not getting access to it yet, so actively refusing it. So there's a massive issue there that we're that's being looked at across the UK. I haven't done any original research, unlike Alex, on this, so these are reflections, but obviously my area being digital health, I've been very interested in how the digital plays into all this, and in many ways there have been great leaps forward in terms of digital applications, particularly around consultations with healthcare professionals. But again, very little research looking into how that sort of pans out in terms of people's access to healthcare, and how that differs across communities. Also, you know, we've seen the trace and track apps sort of come and crash and come back, and who's using those and how's that panning out. Similar with vaccination booking apps, everything's an app basically. Increased home monitoring, self-testing. There's lots of areas where there's openings to do interesting research in terms of differentials and inequalities, which I'm keen to pursue. But also, as well as those sort of direct and obvious digital health areas, there's also areas around that bring the digital and health together around the increased remote working, you know, which has both upsides and downsides, as we all know, but many sort of negative effects on our health, including both mental and physical. And food delivery apps, you know, if you just think how that's promoted and enabled the whole food delivery thing, really throws up that inequalities issue, where the more affluent sit at home protected behind their doors, and the most marginalized groups of society basically put themselves at risk packing and delivering our food so that we can stay safe. I include myself in the more affluent. So there are all these really interesting, both direct and indirect areas around the digital and health and how they come together. And I think that's just an area I wanted to raise because I wasn't sure if anybody else would, maybe for questions and discussion, and also for more detailed research for a chapter I'm writing for a critical sociology of health type collection that's being done led by Alan Peterson in Melbourne next year. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's really interesting. And I'm sure some people will take you up on the digital health stuff. I think there's some really interesting points in there. But now we're going to move up to Ruth and hear what Ruth has to say about the UK situation. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Ruth Chadwick. I'm a bioethicist and Professor Emerita at Cardiff University in UK. And as Felice anticipated, there is a little bit of overlap between our presentations. So the first thing I want to say is that in the UK, it may be important to point out that the constituent countries of the Union have had different measures and to some extent experiences. So I can best speak about England. However, the theme that I want to speak about is universal, and that relates to health inequalities, but also related social inequalities. And my main message is that, of course, it's not surprising that existing inequalities have been reflected in the pandemic, but they've been put under the spotlight in sometimes unexpected ways. So I want to draw attention to sections of the community that have been particularly disadvantaged and suggest that one outcome of the pandemic is that the social determinants of health must and will receive greater attention in future. First, it's unfortunately no surprise that Black and minority ethnic groups have been more adversely affected by the pandemic, not only in terms of serious disease incidence and incidence of death, but also insofar as their vaccination rates are lower, as Felice said. The latter purportedly because of greater vaccine hesitancy in those communities, and there are ongoing efforts to address this. But an unforeseen, but perhaps not unforeseeable effect of the pandemic have been the implications for social care. This has long been known to be a sector that was underfunded and which had little voice. What has been shocking, however, has been the way in which COVID-19 was unthinkingly imported into care homes to some of the most vulnerable people by the discharge of COVID-positive patients into those homes. Not only are the residents of care homes themselves particularly vulnerable, but their carers may be also. They're poorly paid, and it's emerged that they were unable to access proper personal protective equipment early in the pandemic because it was earmarked for the NHS. It's to be hoped that the spotlight on this issue will lead to more remedial action in the years ahead beyond the current crisis. Another section of the community that has come to light as particularly disadvantaged is persons with disabilities. In particular, learning disabilities, who may not be able to speak for themselves. Only this week, it has been agreed, finally, following publicity led by a celebrity, that they should be moved up the priority list for vaccination, which wasn't the case before. The intergenerational justice issue has, of course, been very much in the foreground, with the greater risk to the elderly in the pandemic of serious disease and death, while the loss to younger people has been primarily in terms of social life, education, and employment opportunities at the entry level, with associated physical and mental health concerns. These issues are going to feed into health inequality debates for decades to come, along with the increasing recognition of social determinants of health, at a time when the pandemic has provided opportunities for the rich to get richer, while others have been in danger of losing their livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth. A lot of very interesting points you've raised there, and certainly a lot of food for thought. So now we're going to move over to Europe and over to Portugal and hear from Brigida. Thank you. So we can't hear you yet. You're still on mute.
Thanks. And thanks for organizing this meetup as well. I think I'm going to follow some of the things that you previously speak about, because I think we are facing many issues that are the same. So
I'm just tell everybody where you're from.
Yes, yeah. So I'm Dejesus. I'm PhD fellow in ISCTE, in Center for Research and Studies in Sociology in Lisbon, Portugal. And I have been researching biobanking in Portugal from a health sociology perspective. And now I'm moving tomorrow to another place, to the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Lisbon for a project on medical data. So about today's topic, I would like to set first of all, a very brief picture of the situation in Portugal. Our first case was diagnosed in beginning of March. In the middle of the month, we have around 650 cases. So we had the first total lockdown based in European situation. And after 1.5 months of lockdown, some services and schools started to reopen. Work from home was encouraged whenever it's possible until today. Now we are at the moment in the third lockdown, and the second was before Christmas, but quite ineffective since restrictions were not that strict. You really cannot realize what lockdown are we talking about. So after Christmas, the number of cases grown drastically. And so in the last week of January, we've gone for the third lockdown. And we have raised 300 deaths per day and almost 1,000 people in critical care. So now the numbers dropped again, and we're said to have the lowest transmission rate in Europe. But of course, we are at home, so it's normal and expected. And vaccination already started. And from the beginning, we had the policy of massive testing. And maybe that's why the number of cases was so high at a certain point when compared to other countries. So also a little bit of context about Portugal. We have a public health service similar to the UK, complemented by private healthcare offer. However, this public service has been weakened throughout the years, particularly with the insufficient hiring of human resources. And they are not enough in regular situation to respond to the healthcare needs. So pandemic then is expected to drown the health system capacity in all of its fronts, from emergencies and of course critical care and hospitalization. So there are many, many challenges I would like to address, especially the way communication has been held all the time during these pandemics. This was a problem at different levels, from health authorities to scientific institutions, government, and the media. I would like to say something about some examples. For example, the technical decisions were daily communicated by Health Director General, and although she seems quite competent, she is no good communicator for a public audience. So in some cases, the communication was confusing, and many times it generated immediate disagreement, since the decisions did not respond to the public fear or claims. Also, the first responsible for national vaccination strategy did some public presentations that left the impression of not being reliable, and once again creating the feeling of distrust among the population. So not all politicians agreed with the technical decisions, expressing often their disagreement about the use of masks, the organization of political events, or even about the priorities established for the vaccination. And alongside of these official channels of communication, all types of communication were spreading in the media and social media. In the media, there seemed to be a constant effort to show the divergence of health authorities' reports and the situation in hospitals. For example, regarding the numbers of cases or the availability of individual protection equipment. Also, the scientific data released every day in daily news wasn't of great help, creating mistrust again, especially among the ones with low scientific literacy. Also, in social media, the pandemic led to an emergency of conspiracy theories and also strengthened hate discourses. And one of the movements that congregate many of these voices was Doctors for the Truth, constituted by some health professionals, but also by others non-health professionals. They are called nowadays the deniers because they keep refusing the severity of COVID consequences. And this movement stated many points of disagreement in the health public measures, but their position was somehow misinterpreted, and at a certain point gather other positions that give even more strength to discontentment, combining with this dissatisfaction with the restrictive measures. And they talk a lot about government surveillance, as you said also before. And this bring unintended consequences about the idea of a renaissance of fascism and dictatorship that we had until 46 years ago. So this topic is actually a very sensitive one, and it might be one of the most unexpected ones. The declaring of the state of emergency was a big deal, and all the politicians shown discomfort with implementing restrictions to the fundamental liberties. And it's kind of an activation of a collective memory of repression that generally nobody wants to return to that moment in time. So this particular idea had taken us to weird situations, like should we celebrate the 25th of April, it was the Liberty Day and the end of dictatorship, in Parliament Hall, or should we allow the summer political festival that was held every year, or should we allow political parties conventions? Because if the events were prohibited, we have to deal with this ghost of fascism, and if they are allowed, we will commit public health. So it really raised this debate, what it's allowed and what it's not, and are we going to recover this fascism idea or not? So this, I think it's the most unintended consequences, but it's also political, without police, but this idea of surveillance and government surveillance, even denied by the government.
Right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's also very interesting. Honestly, everything is so interesting. I have 1,000 questions, really. But firstly, before we ask any, we'll move on now to Priya. So over to Priya.
Hello, so my name is Priya Satarkar. I am a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at University of Ghent in Belgium. So employed in Belgium, working from home in Switzerland, and I am Indian and my family is in India. So for this session, I'm going to focus on India. First thing to clarify, I am sharing my impressions or reflections on what's happening in India in context of this pandemic. As a trained medical doctor during the peak of the epidemic, I received communication asking me to join the workforce at COVID care centers, but of course I was in Switzerland, I couldn't travel. What I have been following closely is the Indian media, not just the mainstream, but not so mainstream, which has been the critical voice in this pandemic. I have kept close contact with my former medical colleagues and also a lot of NGOs who have been on the forefront of relief in many ways during the pandemic, and also with my own family members. So there are a number of things which are peculiar about India's epidemic. We are 1.3 billion population. So far, we have reported 11 million cases. So these are reported cases. We have 156,000 deaths. So case fatality in India is extremely low. And that's interesting. And it really raises a lot of epidemiological questions. One of the commonest answers given to this is that we have a very different age profile of our population. So it's still a younger population, and that's why the fatality rate has been lower. But I guess there are more factors than what we see. We only have had first wave so far. And this first wave peaked in the middle of September, where we reported approximately 97,000 new cases every day. And since then, there has been a gradual decline. In January, we were even reporting less than 10,000 cases. Nobody understood how this is possible. Since last 3 to 4 days, we are again seeing increase in number of reported cases, especially in the western state of Maharashtra, where I come from. In certain regions, the cases and also the fatality is increasing quite drastically. And there are talks about again imposing lockdown. So India's response to the epidemic in the beginning, we had a nationwide, very strict and very sudden onset lockdown somewhere in end of March. So a lot of people congratulated India for leadership and how strict and strong we were, but there was also the negative side to that sudden onset, very strong lockdown. India saw incredible internal migration of laborers from cities going back to rural areas because they lost their jobs, they couldn't sustain themselves in the cities. And then there was this international uproar and also media coverage with titles like Millions Marching Home. And on that march, number of people also lost their lives. It was again heartbreaking to see how little intervention happened from the government side, but the good thing to see was how communities step up and how NGOs and humanitarian organizations started helping, supplying water, because month of April and May in India is extreme hot summer and people were dehydrated while walking thousands of kilometers back home. So that community spirit was quite striking, but also because of this migration, the virus, which was initially in the big cities, landed up in different parts of rural communities in India as well. There have been serosurveillance studies which show up to 70% of positivity rates for antibodies in certain sections or certain pockets of big cities, which again show us that probably we didn't pick up all the infection to begin with. Now, since last few days, there has been a talk about Indian variant of Indian variant of the virus. We still don't know for sure what this Indian variant look like. Genome sequencing is on the way, but I'm also not sure how much we would find out and when we would find out exactly what would happen or what is happening with this variant. Another aspect which was interesting about India was that there were some strange claims about when the vaccine will be available, absolutely unrealistic claims. And there it was striking to see how the critical voices were raised. So these critical voices were from the academicians, from the healthcare professionals, but also ethics community came up in a strong way, in a collective way to challenge and to say, let's not make such statements which destroy the trust. And also at the same time, make people believe that vaccine is just around the corner so we can behave without worrying about what happens with the pandemic. Another thing which is striking about India is this fatality rate. And some actually say that we don't really have systematic data. So there have been studies across the world where people have compared the deaths previous year in the same period to see how much death reporting has been missed. But in India, we couldn't do that. But people always argued that at cremation centers, we didn't have situation where we simply couldn't keep up with the cremation. So it's really unsure what was happening, what was going on, and we would need loads and loads of research onto this topic. One other aspect I want to focus on is the impact on school education. And this is something that really worries me. So India is a country where education is your access and passport to getting out of poverty trap. Since March, more or less in many parts, education has been from home, but this is only possible for middle class and higher middle class or rich people who can work from home or who can have their children with internet connection or tabs or computers and they could learn. But that's not the reality of large majority of Indian students. Especially in rural areas, we also have midday meal programs where children not only get education, but they get one warm, nutritious meal in the school. And that has been now affected. So we are also pushing these children into malnutrition, not just protein energy malnutrition, but also other aspects. So the impact of these children being out of school is going to be long term. And we will have to really see what it does to the whole generation, which will miss out. And these are the children who come from families where parents may not be fully educated, and these have the least resources to catch up with the others. So what we are in fact doing is that the poor are getting much worse off and push down the poverty trap, while the others, middle class onwards, our lives can go on almost as normal as it possibly can. Thank you so much.
Priya, that's really interesting and certainly echoing the equality or inequality issues we've already been discussing. That's fascinating. Okay, so now we're moving down to Australia, my backyard. So over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm Mary Walker. I'm a lecturer at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So I wanted to talk about some effects that I think are not really unexpected, but certainly unintended. So the context in Melbourne is that we've had several quite long lockdowns. I was only back in Melbourne for around the start of the second lockdown, which went on for a few months and was quite strict. A curfew, 4 acceptable reasons to leave home. So it was quite a strict lockdown, and it in terms of responding to the second wave of the virus here, it was, I guess, counted as a success without wanting to trivialize the lives that were lost. So we've lost 909 lives in Australia to date. But I guess comparatively, in terms of proportions with other countries, Australia has done fairly well. But I guess that what it makes a bit more stark in Australia are the effects of lockdown. And so what I wanted to focus on were just issues around mental health, and these are things that are still kind of emerging, and there's not good statistics on any of these things yet, because I think that the effects will probably play out in a longer term as well. So it will take, perhaps a few years or even longer for us to see what those effects have been. But so far we know that there have been increased calls to suicide hotlines, there have been increased calls to domestic violence hotlines, there's been increased Google searches related to domestic violence and supports. There's been conflicting information about drug and alcohol use. It seems that during the first lockdown, there's some conflicting information, but it seems like overall people were drinking more alcohol in the first lockdown and drinking it at home, so more likely to be sitting at home on their own drinking or drinking with their families, but of course not going out and drinking in a nightlife situation. That trend seems to have reversed in the second lockdown and to have normalized. But that said, among a minority of people in the surveys that they've done so far have reported that their drinking has become problematic and has increased in a way that's continued after lockdown lifted. And people who work in that area are very much expecting problematic drinking to rise in the next couple of years as a result. There's been some modelling around predictions around suicide rates. There's been a few different studies, but it's been predicted to increase suicide over the next couple of years, somewhere up to 25%. So I think, none of those effects are particularly unexpected, but certainly unintended. And I think they all play into each other, and they seem to be related to a few different aspects of lockdown, of people spending more time alone at home or with their families at home, and potentially with abusers or in dysfunctional situations at home. And then we see increased alcohol and some other drugs being used, either because people are stressed and they're self-medicating, or some people in the surveys reported that they just had nothing to do, that were stuck at home with nothing to do, and that was their form of recreation, I guess, or interacted with their forms of recreation. So I think in Australia those effects will continue to play out over the next few years, and I guess perhaps longer. And like I said, there's starting to be some research, or more robust research around what the actual levels of these things are, and they also interact with some of the issues others have brought up around inequality. So, for example, the unemployment rates are hitting women much harder than men here, increased unemployment. So we see reversals of progress in terms of addressing inequalities.
Yes, I was going to say thank you, Mary. Unless there's one last point you'd like to make, I'm just mindful that the time is raging on.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. It's time now to go to our last country, and that is New Zealand, where Denise looks like she's sitting in a jungle, actually.
I know, I don't know why the alien effects come on, but I'm too scared to touch it in case I disappear again. Well, kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm Denise Steers from University of Wellington, where I'm doing my postdoc. And first off, I just want to really acknowledge how privileged we are here in New Zealand, being a small island nation with a compassionate and decisive, extraordinary Prime Minister as a leader, who has prioritised with her government health over economics. And I think that has been reflective of how we've managed to have such small numbers of COVID. We've only had 2,368 cases, 2,277 of those have recovered, and we did have 26 deaths. But, hearing what's going on in the rest of the world, it really humbles me to realise how very lucky we are here. And partly that's because we're so far away. We're a very tiny nation, only 5 million. But I think the key thing for us is we've had this really fantastic communication between the leaders of our government and the leaders of our public health sector. So I've just got them here to pop in. So we've got Jacinda and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, who is our Director of Health, and they are joining us. They got their own merch as a result of COVID-19, because people they were there every day at 1 o'clock together, pulling us all together, and use terms like create your bubble, team of 5 million, and really were very empathetic with us about, they did just such excellent communication around, they had scientists, they talked about the science, and I think one of the unintended consequences is that scientists and public health has really elevated itself in the New Zealand psyche. Like, people wanted to name Ashley Bloomfield, who's the Director of Health, New Zealander of the Year. Of course, he humbly said, no, thank you, that's very kind of you, but I'm just doing my job. But it's that sort of thing that I think is a bit different for us from other countries where we've had a very cohesive, it's a central government, no states to contend with or different groupings. We've just had the one message, the clear message, fabulous social media, fabulous ads that constantly kind of keep it present in our mind. So I think that's where public health has really stepped up, but also joined with the politics. So I feel very privileged that we've been fortunate to have that, because I think that has helped us to keep such COVID at such at bay. I think the challenge for us is maintaining that communication, maintaining that kind of emphasis to keep going. We've had 2 short lockdowns with a couple of little tiny clusters. The whole nation didn't close down, just Auckland, because that's our largest city. So sometimes there's a bit of complacency around. With our recent cluster we've just had in the last 2 weeks, we all dropped. We have 1 to 4 levels, level 4 being the most. We all had to drop. The rest of the country was in level 2 and Auckland was in level 3, but it was only a week and it was quite contained, but there was a little bit of complacency. So I think that has been something that will be an ongoing challenge, is to, because it's so surreal for us to seeing what's going on in the rest of the world, because it's not nearly as bad here. I think one of the other challenges is the border. People are sometimes get very nervous about having people come from other countries and want to get a bit punitive and ban people from various hotspots, but our government's been very clear about, no, let's just stick to our border quarantine. I think an unexpected consequences, we've had a whole thousands and thousands and thousands of New Zealanders return to New Zealand permanently. A lot, and so we talked about a brain drain happening where people left New Zealand to go and be in other parts of the world, but they're all returning. So that's had quite a positive effect for developing things that would perhaps be developed overseas. Other things has been, like other people have talked about, that highlighting that inequities. Like, for example, homeless people, suddenly people flipped into action, and they were all, not all, but most were housed in motels. So it really highlighted that things can happen for these people who often are just neglected. So, and I think that opened the eyes to other New Zealanders who perhaps weren't so aware of those things. But also we've had, obviously that we had very good economic support as well, cut the red tape, people got their money really quickly. So people who were in those lower economic situations got access to money quite quickly, and so did employers. I think, and also like the government, all the Prime Minister and ministers all took 20% pay cut for 6 months. So just things like that, joining in to support, be part of that team. I think it's, we've all developed a new language like bubble. Abundance of caution is our new one that everyone keeps talking about. We're taking an abundance of caution approach. The new normal. Picking up on Mary's thing, of course there were increases in domestic violence, drinking, all those sort of things. But one of the things that did change is street drugs, especially like methamphetamine. A lot of our drug producing situations get products from overseas to make the drugs, but because of the no international flights, border control, that became an issue in the sense of people have drug makers having to become creative with what they make those drugs with. So that's caused some interesting results. Just kind of other little weird things. We had like birdsong during all the lockdowns. Suddenly there were more birds around, more people were cycling, more people got pets. The SPCA had a run of people collecting pets for lockdown. More people now working from home is just it's a new normal, not because of COVID, just because they realised they could work from home and be effective. There's also been much more focus on public health for other communicable diseases. So like, for example, in 2018, we had a measles outbreak in the Pacific Islands, and probably a New Zealander going to the Pacific Island. So now there's a big measles campaign, which they've been really hitting hard here, and they link it to COVID-19. This is more contagious than COVID-19. So it's had a flow-on effect for other public health issues. That's something that I've noticed. Increase in local.
Denise, I might just stop you there. That's really, it's really very interesting, but I'm just also very mindful of the time, and it might be the case that some people do need to leave, very promptly when this is supposed to finish. So I think we understand that we can continue to talk for a little bit longer. Is that your understanding, Diane, that we can talk for a few more minutes?
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, we've got a few questions or comments here in the chat, and I was just going to say before I bring your attention to those, I mean, it seems to me that effectively we're all the sort of common themes that have come out very much are things about the sort of inequalities, the political issues, the policing, and of course the long-term effects, which will be on things like education, but also on mental health. I mean, there's a whole range of long-term effects. And it's also interesting the way in which every different place has been collecting or not collecting data. And there's a comment in the chat here about, could we potentially all contribute information to the Brochure Foundation to come up with some kind of comparative data? I mean, I'd be interested to hear what other panelists would say about this, but I have to say, certainly in Australia, we're aware that there are quite a few organisations that are collecting data from lots of different places. And I kind of feel that there's a lot of numerical data being collected on those kinds of hard data that you can collect. But from my perspective, I think what's missing is the kind of qualitative in-depth stuff. I mean, we're not really hearing a lot about the real lived experience. And I think that will form something that's really important in the future. But I'd just be interested to hear, this is from France Poursault, would it be possible for the Brochure Foundation to collect data from interested participants describing standardised data from their country? So I don't know whether anyone else would like to comment on that. No? Okay. Well, it seems Anique said that we do have the possibility to be able to do something like this. And I mean, I think that if there are people who are interested who are listening, that maybe they should let Anique know. It would be something that she could potentially pull together. So Denise, specifically, there's a question here to you. Have community activists and volunteers been mobilised to help out? What tasks have they carried out?
Well, I think that was the other thing I wanted to say is that there was just this generosity of spirit in people helping each other, and all the usual community groups did, but all had to do their kind of, 2 metre distancing. But there were lots of things like people dropping off bread to people's houses, but, food, all of those sort of things. That we do have they call it the student army, the volunteer army, that they also were out in force like they had been during the earthquake, and where they rallied round and dropped off food and did things especially for the people who are on their own or the elderly. So there was a lot of social media connection and checking on your neighbours. Even though everyone was in their own little bubble, there were ways that people did things. So, like, for example, on our street, one of the children across the road had their birthday, so everyone just came out to their driveway and sang happy birthday, and then just went back into their bubbles. I know that's only a tiny little example, it's not a volunteer thing, but just there were lots of examples of people connecting. And I think, again, that was the brilliance of Jacinda and Ashley saying things like, this is a physical distancing, not a social distancing, and really using that language to try and keep people connecting. And all of their kind of advertising was about checking with people and taking on that social responsibility. And I think that was something that was really heartening to see, just that kind of people would try really hard.
I was going to say, I mean, in Australia, we certainly got the reports from Jacinda Ardern speaking, and she's the most amazing communicator. And this is obviously what, Brigida, you were saying wasn't happening very well in Portugal. But I just wanted to briefly come back to Alex, because, I mean, it struck me that we also had police here in Australia who were giving fines for people who were further than 5 kilometres from their house. sometimes in really illogical ways. For example, there was a mother and daughter who were out doing driving practice. They had no intention of actually getting out of the car at any point, but because they were more than 5 kilometres away from their home, they received a fine. And it seemed to me that there was a sort of blind following on of these laws without actually thinking through why we are really doing it. Is that what you're finding in Canada?
Yeah, it was more of a technical approach and deputizing people who don't have public health expertise to be in enforcing or determining what is or what is not a public health risk, and actually ended up kind of enforcing more in a technical way. So we had rules here that bylaw officers could stop people who didn't look like they lived in the same home. So the unintended consequence of that is like lesbian couples were stopped because they didn't look like they lived in the same home and harassed by police. Elderly people with their nieces or nephews were stopped and harassed while they were walking and trying to socialize. So yeah, it happened in a more technical way, as opposed to looking at where there actually is risks of transmission. So it's kind of an unintended consequence there for sure.
So can I just also ask, and please feel free anyone to ask any questions at all, but Flius, I just wanted to ask you, with the apps that have been used all the time in the UK, is there any possibility that they could be used for data extraction? Would those manufacturers or makers of those apps talk to each other in order to be able to pull out big data?
Okay, so I'm not an expert. I haven't done any, as I said, any new sort of research into it, but following the sort of debates in the news and things about the apps, no, you know, they're not meant to enable big data collection. They are meant to be used purely for the purpose of identifying and tracking, identifying positive people and tracking any contacts they've had. I mean, that's the track and tracing app. There's another app which, and I think it's run out of either UCL or King's. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Ruth might know. Where you can voluntarily submit your symptoms on a daily or weekly basis. That is with the purpose of generating big data that can be used for research purposes. Not for surveillance. I don't think anybody's particularly worried about that in terms of surveillance. I think they see it as quite a positive step in terms of sort of almost citizen science, you know, sort of that sort of approach. I don't know if Ruth knows any more about that.
Yes, unfortunately, Ruth had to go, so we don't. Yeah. I mean, I do think I personally find it quite interesting because I've been a bit involved in some data linkage, how differently people have been recording their data. And I think that's been, you know, always one of the biggest hiccups is the sort of lack of absolutely, you know, things are not always identical, and that's going to make things really, really difficult. But even hearing Ruth say something before about her symptoms, having had the vaccine recently, I mean, there's been absolutely no information about side effects, at least that we've heard in Australia, that's been publicly reported, although everyone's reporting great joy at being able to get the vaccine. But I mean, even that I find kind of quite interesting in terms of lived experience. Yeah. So does anyone have any other questions that they would like to ask? Diane, have I missed anything in the chat that is important to say?
I could just make a comment on one that one person has made about sometimes people getting angry at people when they do have COVID and it starts a new cluster and there's a lockdown. And there has been a bit of that in New Zealand, especially with the recent one. The one before the recent one where it was in a Pacific Island community, and Pacific Island families often are big families and churchgoers and go to, you know, big groupings. So there was a little bit of some people being a little bit unkind on social media. But again, I think what happened was there was a constant message from the Prime Minister and Ashley Bloomfield and the Minister of Health saying, be kind to each other. No one chooses to get COVID. No one wants to spread it. So there's this constant kind of trying to help those people who are negative to think differently about it. And in the main, I think most people are pretty good. Sometimes the media whips it up a bit. One of the other things that happen is because we've seen so much about America and other countries where there's been that kind of conspiracy theories around COVID, and even in Australia, people protesting about the social distancing. That has had a little flow-on effect for some people here in this country, where, you know, they've had Trump hats on and marching, and only it's tiny, like, you know, 80 people or something, not like hundreds. But it's been interesting that that kind of influence from what you view out in the rest of the world coming into, you know, just, I think, hype up a little bit of that here.
I think it's also very interesting to hear what kind of coverage people are aware of, because one of the reasons that we actually wanted to do this meetup today is because, you know, in Australia, we hear probably a bit more about what's happening in Asia. Obviously, we hear about the US and the UK, but we don't necessarily hear the details of what's happening in other countries. And I mean, I was really fascinated to hear that in Taiwan, for example, they did a lot of management by using technical means. So they monitored people using their phones, and they very early on, you know, if people came into the country from outside, they said you can isolate at home, but we're just going to be monitoring your phone all the time to make sure you don't leave home. And they had apps to sort of let people know where the nearest place was to get masks, you know, if they ran out of masks, and, you know, really, really interesting way of managing it. And I just noticed on the Lowy Institute's kind of ranking, I think Taiwan was third, New Zealand was first, I think Vietnam second, and Taiwan third in terms of how it's all been managed. So it's really, it's just really very interesting the way each country has kind of have dealt with this. So I'm just noticing that it's now almost 10 past midnight for me. So I'm wondering whether or not we should bring the formal part of this to a close. And so firstly, I'd like to thank all the panelists for spending some time with us and getting up at different times of the day or going to bed later. I'd like to thank the Brochure Foundation for the technical and administrative support. And of course, I'm sure all of you would join me in wanting to thank the Brochure Foundation in their efforts to keep us all connected. I mean, we're all really privileged to belong to this network of people who've benefited so much from the generosity of the foundation. And we would love to obviously maintain that relationship. So I look forward to seeing you all at the next meetup. I hope we all have a chance to get together again soon. And depending on wherever you are in the world, I'll say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.